In 1903, in Richmond, Virginia, a black woman stood up in front of a room full of people and announced that she was going to found a bank. Not apply for a loan at a bank. Not ask a bank for help. Found one. Charter it. Let it. In the Jim Crow South. In a city where the laws, the customs, and the entire architecture of American society had been constructed with one very specific purpose: to make certain that a moment like this one never happened. Her name was Maggie Lena Walker. She was the daughter of a woman who had been born into slavery. And what she was about to build, in a country that had spent decades telling her community exactly how little they were allowed to own, would make her the first woman in the history of the United States of America to found and serve as president of a bank. Think about what it takes to stand in a room like that and say something like that out loud. Not with anger, not with desperation, with clarity, with a plan. Maggie Lena Walker had not arrived at that moment by accident. She had spent years watching her community locked out of the financial system that every other American was told was available to them. Unable to get mortgages, unable to get business loans, unable to build generational wealth because the doors through which wealth was built had been deliberately, systematically closed. She had watched the organization she led, the Independent Order of St. Luke, nearly collapse under the weight of debt and dwindling membership. She had inherited a treasury with $31.61 in it. And rather than accept what that number said about the limits of what was possible, she looked at it and saw something different. She saw the beginning. What Maggie Lena Walker understood in that room in Richmond in 1903, what she had quietly understood for years before she ever stood up to say it, was that the most powerful response to a system designed to exclude you is not to wait for it to change. It is to build something the system cannot ignore. What she built from $31.61 in the Jim Crow South, as a black woman in an era that offered her almost nothing, is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in the entire history of American finance. And by the time this story is over, you will never look at a locked door the same way again. Before we go further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if stories like this move you, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we uncover next on The Silent Fortunes. Her name was Maggie Lena Walker. And before we go any further into what she built, let us be clear about what she was working with when she started. She had no wealthy backers. She had no family money. She had no connections to the financial institutions that controlled capital in America at the turn of the 20th century, because those institutions had made it abundantly clear, through both law and practice, that they had no interest in doing business with the community she represented. She was a black woman in the Jim Crow South, leading a nearly bankrupt mutual aid organization with $31.61 in its treasury, in a city and a country that had constructed an entire system of laws specifically designed to prevent the kind of wealth building she was about to attempt. So how does a woman like that, with those resources, in that environment, in that era, build a financial institution that serves an entire community the rest of America has deliberately locked out? What did Maggie Lena Walker understand about wealth, about community, about the relationship between money and power that nobody else around her had yet put into practice? And perhaps the question that should stay with every person watching this for the rest of the day: why has almost nobody outside of Richmond, Virginia ever heard her name, when what she accomplished was one of the most remarkable feats of financial leadership in the entire history of this country? Those are the questions at the heart of this story, because what Maggie Lena Walker built was not just a bank. It was proof that the most powerful response to a system that excludes you is not to protest it, not to wait for it to change, but to build something so solid and so necessary that the system eventually has no choice but to acknowledge it existed. And it started with $31.61, and a woman who had decided that was enough to begin. Maggie Lena Walker was born on July 15, 1864, in Richmond, Virginia, less than a year before the end of the Civil War, in a city that had served as the capital of the Confederacy, in a country that was still in the process of deciding what freedom was actually going to mean for the people it had just emancipated. Her mother, Elizabeth Draper, had been born into slavery. Her father was an Irish-born man named Eccles Cuthbert, who was not present in Maggie's life in any meaningful way. It was Elizabeth Draper, a laundress, a woman who took in other people's clothes and washed them by hand to keep her family alive, who raised Maggie in post-Civil War Richmond, in a community navigating the brutal and complicated realities of Reconstruction. The promises of that era were real but fragile, and the rising tide of Jim Crow laws was already beginning to dismantle them, one statute at a time, before Maggie Lena Walker was old enough to fully understand what was being taken. She was educated during a period when the education of black children in the South was both limited in availability and actively opposed by significant portions of the white community around her. She attended and graduated from Armstrong Normal School in Richmond in 1883, an achievement that required persistence and family sacrifice in an environment that offered neither encouragement nor guarantee. She worked briefly as a teacher after graduation, one of the few professional paths available to educated black women in the post-Reconstruction South. And then, at age 14, years before her teaching career, she had joined an organization that would quietly become the foundation of everything she would later build. The Independent Order of St. Luke was a black fraternal organization founded in Baltimore in 1867, dedicated to providing mutual aid, insurance, and community support to its members at a time when mainstream American institutions offered black Americans almost none of these things. Maggie Lena Walker joined at 14 and never left. In 1886, she married Armstead Walker Jr. and shifted her focus toward raising her family, while continuing to deepen her involvement in the Order of St. Luke. Through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, as she grew into a more prominent role within the organization, what she found was deeply troubling. The Independent Order of St. Luke was in serious trouble. Membership was declining. The treasury was nearly empty. Debt had accumulated to the point where the organization's survival was genuinely uncertain. The very institution that had been built to protect and support the black community of Richmond was itself on the edge of collapse. Underfunded, understaffed, and losing the confidence of the people it existed to serve. For most people inheriting a situation like that, the rational response would have been to manage the decline, to hold what little remained together for as long as possible, and to accept that some things cannot be saved. Maggie Lena Walker was not most people, and what she was about to do with a broken organization and an empty treasury was about to change an entire community forever. In 1899, Maggie Lena Walker was appointed Right Worthy Grand Secretary of the Independent Order of St. Luke. It was the most senior administrative position in the organization. And what she inherited when she took that position was this: a treasury containing $31.61 and a debt load of over $400. For an organization whose entire purpose was to provide financial security and community support to black Americans in Richmond, Virginia, those numbers were not just discouraging. They were a crisis. The organization entrusted with protecting a community that had nowhere else to turn was itself on the edge of disappearing. And the woman now responsible for it had been handed a set of books that told her, in the plainest possible financial language, that failure was the most likely outcome. But the numbers inside the Order of St. Luke's treasury were only one part of the reality Maggie Lena Walker was now responsible for navigating. The larger reality was the world outside those books. Jim Crow, Virginia at the turn of the 20th century, where the systematic exclusion of black Americans from economic participation was not accidental, not informal, and not the result of individual prejudice alone. It was structural. It was legal. Banks in Richmond did not lend to black Americans. Business loans were not available. Mortgages were not available. The pathways through which white Americans built generational wealth, property ownership, credit, banking access, business formation, were blocked at every turn for the community Maggie Lena Walker had been entrusted to serve. She was not leading an organization in a difficult market. She was leading an organization serving a community that the entire financial architecture of the United States had been deliberately designed to keep permanently poor. Think about what that specific weight feels like. Not the weight of personal failure, which is heavy enough, but the weight of being responsible for other people's survival in a system that has decided their survival is not its concern. Every person watching this who has ever carried responsibility for others while facing a system that seemed designed specifically to stop them understands something of what Maggie Lena Walker was carrying in 1899. The world around her was not neutral. It was actively hostile. The message from every institution, every law, and every custom of the era was the same: that black Americans should not have banks, that women should not lead financial institutions, and that what Maggie Lena Walker was beginning to think about building in Richmond, Virginia, was something the Jim Crow South would never allow to exist. She heard all of it. She understood exactly what she was up against. And just when it seemed like there was no way out, something shifted. Here is where everything changed. And what changed was not the system around Maggie Lena Walker, because the system did not change. Jim Crow Virginia in 1903 was exactly as hostile to black economic ambition as it had been in 1899. The banks were still closed. The laws were still in place. The cultural assumptions about what a black woman from Richmond was allowed to build were exactly where they had always been. What changed was the way Maggie Lena Walker looked at the organization she had inherited. She stopped seeing the Independent Order of St. Luke as a struggling mutual aid society that needed to be saved. She started seeing it as the foundation of something the community around her had never had, an entire economic ecosystem built from the inside that did not require the permission or participation of the system that had been excluding them. The specific decision that came from that shift in vision was this. In 1903, Maggie Lena Walker founded the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank in Richmond, Virginia. She chartered it. She led it. She became, in doing so, the first woman in the history of the United States of America to found and serve as president of a bank. Not co-found, not serve in a supporting role. Found and lead. The bank was designed with a specific and deliberate purpose: to provide mortgages, savings accounts, and loans to black Americans in Richmond who had been systematically turned away by every other financial institution in the city. It was not a charity. It was a bank, run with the same standards and the same expectations of any other financial institution, but serving a community that mainstream American finance had decided was not worth serving. Her philosophy was clear, and she stated it plainly in her own words, that the way for black Americans to build lasting freedom was through economic independence, and that a community which controlled its own money controlled its own destiny. This was not abstract ideology. It was a practical operating principle that she applied to every decision she made. She grew membership in the Independent Order of St. Luke from 3,400 members when she took over to over 100,000 members across the country as the organization's reputation and reach expanded. She launched the St. Luke Herald, a newspaper that gave the community a voice and a platform at a time when mainstream publications either ignored or actively worked against black American interests. She established a department store, the St. Luke Emporium, giving black consumers in Richmond a place to spend their money within their own community rather than in stores that took their money while refusing to hire them or treat them with dignity. She did not wait for the system to include her community. She built a parallel system, piece by piece, that made the exclusion increasingly irrelevant. And if you are watching this right now, if you have ever faced a system that seemed designed specifically to block you from what you were trying to build, Maggie Lena Walker's story asks you one direct question. What parallel structure could you build around the thing that has been stopping you? The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank grew, not with the explosive speed of a company built on investor capital and favorable market conditions, but with the steady, compounding growth of an institution that had earned the trust of a community that had been given very few reasons to trust any financial institution at all. Maggie Lena Walker understood that trust, once earned from people who had been consistently let down, was the most valuable asset a bank could hold. She managed the institution conservatively, carefully, with the kind of long-term thinking that prioritized the stability of the community it served over the short-term appearance of growth. Families in Richmond who had never been allowed to open a savings account, who had never been offered a mortgage, who had been turned away from every other financial door in the city, found one that was open. And they walked through it. And they told others. And the bank grew because it deserved to grow. Then came 1915. In a moment of devastating and tragic accident, Maggie Lena Walker's son Russell mistook his father, Armstead Walker Jr., for a burglar entering their home at night and shot him. Armstead Walker died from his wounds. The man Maggie had built her family with, the partner who had been beside her through everything she had constructed over the previous decades, was gone. Not through illness, not through age, but through a terrible accident that left her son carrying a weight no child should ever have to carry, and left Maggie Lena Walker facing the deepest personal grief of her life. She did not stop working. She grieved, as any person would, and she continued. Because the bank still needed to be run. Because the community still needed to be served. Because the work Maggie Lena Walker had given her life to did not pause for personal loss, and neither did she. Her body began to fail her in ways her will never did. Debilitating arthritis developed over the years, eventually progressing to the point where Maggie Lena Walker could no longer walk. She led from a wheelchair. She continued attending meetings, making decisions, guiding the institution she had built, from a wheelchair, through the 1920s and into the years of the Great Depression, a period that destroyed thousands of American banks, wiped out the savings of millions of Americans, and tested every financial institution in the country to its absolute limit. The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank survived. Through careful management, deep community roots, and the kind of institutional trust that only decades of honest service can build, it survived when far larger and far better resourced banks did not. In 1930, it merged with two other black-owned banks in Richmond to form the Consolidated Bank and Trust Company, an institution that continued serving the Richmond community for decades after Maggie Lena Walker was gone. She had led through personal tragedy. She had led through physical disability. She had led through systemic racism and economic depression. And the things she built outlasted all of it. Today, Maggie Lena Walker is recognized as the first woman in American history to found and serve as president of a bank. Her home on Lee Street in Richmond, Virginia. The same home where she raised her family, where she carried her grief after losing her husband, where she continued working from a wheelchair when her body could no longer carry her through the door, is a National Historic Site, maintained by the National Park Service, standing as a permanent record of what one woman built from $31.61 in a country that had decided, at almost every level, that she was not supposed to build anything at all. So what do we take from the life of Maggie Lena Walker? What are the silent fortunes buried inside this story that most people have never been told? The first silent fortune is this: when the system excludes you, the answer is not to beg for inclusion. It is to build something the system cannot ignore. Maggie Lena Walker did not spend her energy trying to convince the banks of Richmond to open their doors to her community. She opened a door of her own. She built an institution that made the question of whether the existing system would ever include her community increasingly beside the point, because her community now had something that belonged entirely to them. If you have ever spent years trying to get into a room that was never going to let you in, Maggie Lena Walker's story is a quiet but powerful reminder that the room is not the only option. Sometimes the answer is to build the room yourself. The second silent fortune is this: the most powerful thing a leader can do is convince the people around them that their collective strength is greater than any individual obstacle. Maggie Lena Walker did not build the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank alone. She built it by growing the Independent Order of St. Luke from 3,400 members to over 100,000, by convincing an entire community that what they could accomplish together was greater than what any one of them could accomplish separately. She understood that the real asset was never money. The real asset was people who believed in something together. That principle is as true today as it was in Richmond in 1903. And the third silent fortune, the one most people never talk about, is this: personal tragedy and physical limitation do not have to stop the work. Maggie Lena Walker lost her husband to a devastating accident. She lost the full use of her body to a disease that confined her to a wheelchair. And she kept going. Not because she was unaffected by what she had lost. She was human, and she felt every bit of it. But because the work was larger than her personal circumstances, and she knew it. If you are watching this right now and you are carrying something heavy, a loss, a limitation, a closed door that you did not deserve, Maggie Lena Walker's story is proof that the door is not the only way in, and that what you carry does not have to determine how far you go. So here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to sit with it honestly before you answer in the comments below. When Maggie Lena Walker stood in that room in Richmond, Virginia in 1903 and announced that she was founding a bank, as a black woman, the daughter of a former slave, in the Jim Crow South, with $31.61 and a community that had been locked out of every financial door in the country, what do you think the people in that room were thinking? And more importantly, what do you think Maggie Lena Walker herself was thinking in that moment? Was it fear? Was it certainty? Was it something closer to the quiet, unmovable conviction of a person who has already decided, long before the room knew it, that this was going to happen regardless of what anyone in front of her believed? Tell me what you think in the comments below. If Maggie Lena Walker's story gave you something today, a lesson, a perspective, a reason to look differently at the door that has been closed in front of you, then you already know what to do next. Subscribe to The Silent Fortunes, because every single week, we come back here and uncover another story the world forgot to tell.